All right, looks like we have almost everyone. So hi, I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our StratCom Academic Alliance speaker session entitled Multi-Actor Deterrence, Why Multiple Perceptions Matter. I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Michelle Black, for taking the time to present today. Before we get started though, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's brief. So during the presentation or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Ms. Mariah Yeager. Her name is going to be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager, and questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed. So please make sure to send those questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, and more next to your name, and finally rename. Lastly, please keep your video and audio off for the duration of this event, and those who don't do so will be removed from the event. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to her. Dr. Michelle Black is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science for the University of Nebraska-Omaha, and she's the director for Workforce Development and Education for the National Counterterrorism, Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, or NSITE, which is a Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence. She's also a research fellow with the National Strategic Research Institute, or NSRI, at the University of Nebraska, and is a co-editor for Space and Defense Journal. And in addition to her academic career, she's also been, she also has over 17 years of professional experience within the DoD and StratCom specifically. So Dr. Black, I will turn the floor over to you now, and I will also stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, so just give me one moment. There, I think they're working well right now. And again, thank you for having me in this forum. I appreciate everybody attending today, and hopefully I can answer any questions after the session. But I think some of you who know who I am, know quite a bit that deterrence is something that I've been working on, not only as a practitioner, but as an academic for quite some time. So just briefly, here's my bio slide. But, looking through, I've been a deterrence analyst. I've worked as part of the Academic Alliance, not only as a government employee, but also as an academic. And I believe very much so that bringing these two communities together is really important, because I think we learn so much from each other. And essentially what I'm going to walk through today is one of those lessons, that working in the government as well as an academic, it allows you to have a sense of where you can look deeper into something and then question things, and then even be able to provide some experimentation and produce something really exciting. And I'm really happy to show you what I, as well as others, have been working on for quite some time now. So you're going to see right now, this is the background of multi-actor deterrence. And I want to walk through how this concept even started, where the idea came from. So in 2016 to 2017, this idea initially came from discussions with US StratCom. So myself and Dr. Obradovic work quite closely with the Academic Alliance at StratCom. And so we would go in, have discussions with some of the deterrence planners on what deterrence problems were going on, how some of our students could help, and what things needed to be investigated. So after some conversation, we were asked by deterrence planners at StratCom is there a way that we could take this complex situation where there are a lot of actors and put them into a one versus one situation or system? And we were there because we were talking about the term triadic deterrence and extended deterrence, because Dr. Obradovic and I were investigating multiple actors already having an important part in a deterrence scenario. And so when we walked away from that meeting, we really started looking at that question, and we came back and essentially said, we don't think you can do that in this environment. And that was back in 2016. And we said that we feel, it would be irresponsible to even try to do that because you're missing a lot of what's going on in the environment, which has to do with more capabilities and different ways of thinking that actors are participating in conflict or competition. So after that session, after looking to that, that's where the idea came from. And we started researching and writing on this topic. And in 2018, we developed a taxonomy of deterrence terms because we felt that the field just had so many different terms and concepts out there that we wanted to organize it and understand really what the literature was saying. So we developed a taxonomy of different terms, and I'll show you sort of a snapshot in a minute, and started building on the concept and started presenting at conferences and courses about this idea of how do we incorporate multi-actors in a deterrence scenario? What does that look like? And how do we grow, not only as academics, as practitioners, to get a different picture when we're looking at building operations for deterrence? In 2019 and 2020, NATO came to UNO and asked me if I could build a flexible deterrence methodology using this approach, using this multi-actor approach. And we developed an experimentation, and this project took about 2 years, but we built this methodology, and it's a 7-step process, and I have some few slides that can go over it, to test that multi-actor approach through a methodology that could produce some deterrence objectives. And we found some really interesting observations and discovered some great insight during that time where just looking at one actor really limits the scope of what's going on in the conflict situation or the geopolitical situation. And that broadening it to additional actors helps you get a larger view of what could be possible with deterrence and assurance. After that completion of the experimentations, NATO took the methodology, and as I understand it, they're still using it operationally, providing feedback, and even adjusting it to fit their needs. In 2021, the Nebraska University System, along with NSRI, gave it some seed money to build a team that could further this concept. And this is an interdisciplinary team with experts from UNL and UNO. And we're currently building the multi-actor deterrence analysis methodology, which was initially started at NATO, but pulling in the multi-actor deterrence approach. We call this MADAM, and I'll introduce you to the team on a slide in a minute. And then lastly, what's happening today is that the multi-actor defining a concept, which is a publication that Dr. Obradovic and I wrote, has been approved for publication and will be released in a matter of a few weeks through AITHR, the flagship Air Force journal, which is formerly known as SSQ. And so we'll be happy to share that once it's finally published. So that's a little bit of the background. What I like to do when I first talk about the multi-actor deterrence is discuss a little bit of the definitions and terms, because it's important to understand the terms, the concepts, and the strategies, because they're completely different. And diving into this literature and diving into this research, it's important to understand where we've come from, where we are, and where we are when it comes to deterrence. And so here I show Lawrence Freedman's definition of deterrence, and I'm going to read it for you, and then I'm going to break it down and explain how multi-actor is a little bit different from this. So deterrence works best when the targets are able to act rationally, and when the deterrer and the deterred are working within a sufficient shared normative framework, so that it's possible to inculcate a sense of appropriate behavior in defined situations that can be reinforced by a combination of social pressure and a sense of fair and effective punishment. So the difference between what we're trying to do with multi-actor is that we're trying to break down the whole idea is that there is a specific one versus one, or allied versus other, or one side versus another side. And here he has listed deter and the deterred. And we understand that there are different aspects when we're in a deterrent scenario or in an operation that different actors will be viewed differently. So some are not all deterred and some are assured. And that's what we're trying to outline here. Who will be involved in this conflict situation, or who will be involved in a competition situation? As well as here, Friedman says there's a shared normative framework. Ideally, that's where you want to operate in, but you'll have to understand that when you're dealing with the different actors, they may not all have shared normative frameworks. So how do you get them there? Or how do you understand what framework they're operating in? Then finally, the appropriate behavior defined the situations can be reinforced by the social pressure and a sense of fair and effective punishment. You still want to do that within multi-actor, but at the sense is you're trying to understand, is it always punishment, or are you the social pressure, or are you trying to provide different incentives for the actor? So let me move on and show you, and really, you don't need to read through these all, but these are just to give you a snapshot of all the different terms that are associated with deterrence and within the field. And breaking them down and understanding them is vitally important for even the academic and the practitioner, because what we try to do, especially in the article that will be coming out in a few weeks, is that we tried to explain this taxonomy as a way of differentiating between concepts, theories, and strategies. They all have distinct purposes. And it's been written before that we tend to confuse them, that we tend to overlap them. And so separating them out and understanding the difference between a theory and a strategy is vitally important, because we'll have comments that will say we need a new deterrence theory. It's not necessarily a deterrence theory that we're looking at, but it's the strategy, and the strategy, what you're trying to actually impact and the goals that you're trying to achieve, versus the theory is something grounded into what has been tested before. So moving on and understanding why multiple perspectives matter, and essentially what I am trying to get through today and convince you of, is that we're no longer in a competition between actor A versus actor B. Even what we're experiencing with Russia and Ukraine, and I have an example to walk you through that. The geopolitical environment operates differently. So we need to involve those multiple actors and understand their perspectives, because it helps us understand the entire situation. If we were to only plan against one actor, we would remove all their parts of the strategy that they have with different actors as well. And history is focused on powers with nuclear capabilities and keeping that whole one versus one. But we're arguing that today in competition, conflict, war, whatever you want to name it, multiple actors have different capabilities and they're using them, and they're not necessarily limiting themselves because they don't have a nuclear capability. They have what they can use and they'll go ahead and use them. And this is why the cross-domain or multi-domain capabilities matter as well, including in that deterrence scenario. It's not just a conventional or nuclear fight. The capabilities actors bring to the deterrence strategy include cyberspace, information, financial, and legal. And they're going to include those whether we decide that or not. So the definition of multi-actor is really a concept. So we're looking at this as a notion of complex, as a complex system with multiple state and non-state that have conflicting and common interests, and each with different strengths and weaknesses that operate within a new security environment in which nuclear proliferation, cyber, space threats, regional hybrid conflicts simultaneously exist and influence their decision making. Now, I'm going to walk you through this chart because the most important part, and if I have my mouse here and if you can see it, is the perceived future conflict or the geopolitical situation. That's where you start. You're going to look at it because that will help you define what actors are involved. So for example, actor A, actor B, and actor C before may have only included great powers. But now we're saying, hey, if there's a geopolitical situation that you want to examine and that you want to analyze, don't leave other actors out, because as you see close to actor A, there's interests and perceptions that they bring, capabilities, risks, will, and intent that they all bring to this conflict or this situation that you're doing the examination. So let me walk through a little bit of how we did the NATO experimentation. And I have an example that will illustrate the previous slide, this one that I have here, to help really explain multi-actor. So NATO and the experiments, again, they asked to develop a flexible, adaptable deterrence methodology that could incorporate different levels of actors, technologies, and either immediate or within the future. So they wanted something that could be adaptable enough to help them in the future. So over the course of 18 months, the NATO team with myself produced a future scenario test to test the methodology for feasibility and validity. And this in turn developed the 7-step process for deterrence, which you see on my right, which is step 1, assess the threat environment, etc. And I'll walk through that in just a minute. We incorporated students, 9 of them from UNO, to help build strategic profile for the actor decision analysis. And we conducted 2 tests, one in Madrid and then virtually due to COVID. And due to the results, NATO, again, has incorporated this methodology operationally. So the 7-step process essentially has assess the environment, which is your J2 function. They allow to understand first what is the geopolitical situation. Then you identify the actors and produce the strategic profiles with each actor. You perform decision calculi on each of the actors and you overlay them to integrate them. And then you identify the influence points that you can push on, whether they be assurance or whether they be a deterrence. And then those produce deterrence objective, which could then roll into actually COAs, but that will have to be limited to J3 and any operational need. So let me walk through a Russia and Ukraine conflict illustration. It'll be very briefly, but I wanted to add a few states to this so you can see why this is important and to include these multiple perspectives. So normally when we look at deterrence, we usually identify one actor versus the other. So we would say, okay, if we want to deter, then we would be NATO and we would want to deter Russia. So again, it's putting those, the deterrer and the deterred. Multi-actor really spins this on its head and it says, stop before you look there. First, look at the geopolitical situation and what actors actually could be involved, because that's going to define what you can do. Here you see we have Russia and you have Ukraine. You have NATO, Belarus, China, Finland. Obviously, you can add a lot more here, but I'm not going to, really complicate things. But let's just focus on these for a little bit. So Russia, we understand after what's been going on this last month, what their interests, what their perceptions are in regards to this Black Sea area conflict. We've seen what capabilities they're bringing out and what risks, will, and intent they're willing to do. The same with the Ukraine about their interests and perceptions, and they have different capabilities, what their risks, will, and intent are able to do in this particular situation. And then going to NATO, here's the tricky part. You could even break NATO out and start looking at each member in NATO and defining them, because as we have seen, NATO members do have different opinions when it comes to this particular conflict and what they are or are not willing to do. So, however, you can keep it up to the NATO level, defining their interest, perceptions, capabilities, risks, will, and intent. The same as you go around to Belarus, China, and even Finland, as they're all bringing different things to this particular conflict. So let me talk about the current status and the future plans, as I want to stay in time here, and I have a feeling there will be a lot of questions, and that'll help with a nice discussion part. But our current status and future plans is that the team that I have already introduced you to is working on to build scenarios to further test the methodology and refine the concept, because I outlined what a multi-actor approach is, but there's a methodology that goes along with it that we can build deterrence objectives for. So, for example, we could run this scenario through the MADAM, our methodology, to produce deterrence objectives. But I wanted to just give you a snapshot just to show you how multi-actor looks differently than what we normally do. And so currently we're looking into applying for grants and meeting with prospective agencies to build the MADAM laboratory in order to build capabilities and capacity. We want to ensure that this methodology is flexible enough that it can meet needs of different agencies, not just NATO, which was what was tested. So we're going through that right now and seeing if we can further test the methodology, and we're building scenarios. We're also we're training current students in deterrence through this effort. We have grad students that are working through this methodology, and then will hopefully enter the workforce trained in deterrence, specifically through the multi-actor approach. And then, as I mentioned before, we're publishing academic work and presenting at conferences to refine and further ideas. We know that this is not a perfect methodology, and we believe that there's a lot more we can add to it. And that's why questions, forums like this is so helpful, because we take that information back and we add it to our work. We are also investigating automation and computer applications for this methodology. This is one of the feedback that we received during our NATO experimentation. It was very time intensive to walk through this methodology, and it can be difficult. And so, is there a way we can help a planner, an analyst along through this methodology so it may not be so taxing, but still provides the same rigor? This is our research team that we're building myself at the front there. And you've got Dr. Deanna House, who's an assistant professor for information systems and quantitative analysis at UNO. We have Ms. McGilton, who's the Executive Director of Space, Cyber, and Telecom Law and the Nebraska Governance and Technology Center at UNO. We have Dr. Obradovich, the Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of International Studies at UNO, and Dr. Tyler White, the Associate Professor of Practice at Political Science and Director of National Security at UNL. And then, of course, we have a couple of students, Rachel Urban, Josie Nelson, and Steve Sanders, both from UNL and UNO, that are helping us put this research together. So there's a lot of work that we're doing. And I want to stop there. I do have follow-up slides in case you want me to dive in a little bit deeper on the NATO experimentation, even the methodology itself. But that is what I have for you on multi-actor, and I believe I've kept in time too.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Black. All right, let me go ahead and
sharing.
adjust the screen view. Okay, there we go. All right, so now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of today's session. So feel free to keep submitting your questions to Mariah Yeager. Her name is going to be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager. All right, so our first question today comes from Larry Kusnar. And this question is, your point regarding theory versus strategy is well taken. However, strategists and operators do employ theories of change or theories of success. Could the differences between scientific theory versus a pragmatic theory of success, i.e. how well objectives will be achieved, contribute to the confusion?
If I'm understanding it correctly, that, I'm sorry, could you repeat the last bit a little bit, just to make sure I understand?
Yeah, no worries. So the question was, could the difference between scientific theory versus a pragmatic theory of success contribute to the confusion, essentially?
Absolutely, actually. Because what we're looking at and what we've discovered as we're going through this is that, you know, with strategy, you're trying to essentially do something. That pragmatic theory of success still needs, I think, even further refinement and even further testing itself before you can properly say this is a theory of success. With strategies, it's just achieving that goal. It's something to an end or something to a goal, versus where we know concepts are an idea or a notion. Theories are things that have been tested over and over again to ensure that there's an understanding of the way things work. So how do we know about a theory of success? Well, are we actually doing the due diligence that we need to say this is actually successful? And then, of course, you know, if you bring in with a multi-actor and we're saying, oh, the whole environment's changing, I think this is really going to drive this definition of theory of success, because are we truly being successful? And when does success start and stop at the same time? So hopefully I just didn't confuse you more, but I think I agree with that comment, and I think there's more behind it too.
All right, thank you, Dr. Black. Our next question comes from Stephen Downs Martin. And this question is, how does your multi-actor deterrence framework distinguish between actors who are sophisticated about multi-actor deterrence and those who aren't?
Well, I don't think they are even looking at themselves being in a multi-actor deterrence approach. I think whether they're sophisticated or not is defined by the person who's analyzing them. Because if you've noticed, you know, what is sophistication is that bringing a lot of capabilities to this deterrence equation, or are those capabilities more sophisticated than others within the multi-actor dimension? So if they're going to distinguish between themselves, they'll have to start looking at their interests and wills compared to the system. And honestly, I do think actors within the system do look at others and keep that in mind as they're operating within the system. But I don't necessarily say they're going to compare themselves in a sense as they know they're in this system and they know they're more sophisticated, but they're figuring that out as well.
So Todd VZ has asked if you could discuss your working definitions of interests and perceptions. And he says, from an intelligence collection and analysis perspective, how can we reliably assess interests and perceptions as you've defined them?
Right. So the interests and perceptions have to do with the situation or the geopolitical environment that they're in. So how they define them is really, if we're looking at multi-actor, we're defining it as that actor sees it. So what would that actor see themselves as their interests and their perceptions in regards to that conflict or the geopolitical situation? That will help then drive the decision calculus and understanding whether that's going to be pushing their perception on whether they will or will not act, or they will or will not engage in that conflict situation. So as far as J2 is concerned, they're going to have to red hat this. They're going to have to look at it from that perspective rather than what we're defining a interest is for. If we're looking at the Ukraine-Russia conflict situation, if we're going to say, well, Finland, right? What does Finland think in this situation? Some have said that Finland is a little anxious and would like to seek NATO membership now due to this situation. So that's their interest, that's their perception of that situation. Would they normally think that in other conflict situations? Maybe not, but we have to frame it in this geopolitical situation. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you, Dr. Black. Let's go with this question now from William Norris. And the question is, the illustration that you presented used all state actors as nodes in the network. Does your team's approach allow for other levels of analysis, like domestic opposition parties, specific industries or sectors, or even firms?
Absolutely. And so, yes, I use state actors mainly because in a previous speak, I was talking about the Ukraine and Russia conflict. So this just seemed a little bit easier to do. But yes, absolutely, because you're defining an actor in their space. You're not necessarily saying that it has to be a state actor. You could define it as a non-state actor, as an environment, as a, what I'm trying to say, like EU would be another one. Domestic level terrorism you could define. In fact, I recently gave a talk to an organization and they asked specifically about individuals. So I started talking aloud and brainstorming at the same time because what you want to do with that actor is understand their decision making. So you could essentially look at it as an individual or a decentralized group that has a decision level, but different ways of working around a situation. So for example, when we did the NATO experimentation, we looked at groups that were eco-terrorism. And for that helped us understand at a level of how we could analyze groups that aren't necessarily defined the same as actors. And as we put it through the methodology, we were able to test it and we're able to make some conclusions. I think there needs to be a little bit more refinement and more testing, but initially I'm going to say yes. If you have an actor and you have information on them and you can analyze their decision processes, then you can add this to this approach.
Thank you, Dr. Black. Will Dawson has asked, as we're forced to include more actors in our analyses, our uncertainties multiply. What are some of the strategies that you use to properly account for this uncertainty in your analysis?
That's a great question. Because you have limited time to do the analysis, you have to make note of the uncertainties. And so what we're trying to do and what we did during the experimentation is we're looking at risk. So we've incorporated some theories as well as some applications that involve risk. So with the uncertainties, that's where we would put is those risks equations. However, they need further development. And that's what we're working on now, and is essentially trying to gain more resources to investigate risk at a more sophisticated level. But that's where I would place the uncertainties. I agree that you do. When you include other actors, it really gets complicated and it really gets messy. So you have to identify those uncertainties.
Thank you, Dr. Black. Yeah, I understand that that's a big concern when dealing with multiple actors in deterrence all simultaneously.
Right.
So the next question comes from Peter Sharfman, and this question is, traditional dyadic deterrence analysis is strongly supported by game theory. Have you found elements of game theory that help with MADAM?
Yes, in fact, it's incorporated into our main methodology. So we incorporate game theory, we incorporate formal modeling to the extent of our knowledge. And again, that's where we're trying to refine and add what we can with the sophistication of the model. So hence the bringing the interdisciplinary team together and really testing what needs to go in there through. So long answer, yes, of course. I mean, short answer, yes, we're involving game theory. Could it be better? Absolutely. And that's where we'd like to go to the different automation and different mathematical inclusions into the methodology. Because right now, we're really doing all this analysis by hand, and we're doing it with people who may not have experience in game theory or experience in political science deterrence. And so we're teaching them how to do this analysis. I think there's a more sophisticated way to do this.
Thank you, Dr. Black. Dr. Karen Albert asked what the turnaround time is to construct a new scenario with new actors.
Okay, so when we did the NATO experiment, they handed us the scenario, which was great because they identified what's important to them, and then they even identified the actors. So that I couldn't tell you on the turnaround. However, what we're doing now, Dr. Tyler White is working on our scenario development. So the hard part is really identifying the scenario because there seems to be so many scenarios that are important to many agencies. We're trying to pick one that could be applied across multiple agencies to show the feasibility and how this works through. So once you have the scenario built, and the scenario essentially is the definition of what's going on in that environment, and then the actors, the profiles are what feed the actual deterrence methodology. That can take time. So for our NATO experiment, it did take a year, but that was because we had students working on it part-time, and essentially they volunteer their time. So you could do a quick turnaround if you already had most of the profiles done for the actors you want to analyze. So if you went to a J2 shop or you went to an operational shop and they had all these actors that you're interested in and had profiles or at least some information on them, I think that you could do a turnaround pretty quickly because the analysis can be done in a few days. So it's really step one and step two that has the time constraints. But I also argue that most of that stuff is done already through the intelligence offices.
Thank you, Dr. Black. This question also relates to the NATO systems model that you just brought up. So it's from Rick Meisky Jr. And the question is, in your NATO systems model, what are you seeing as what are you seeing or using as feedback loops between the various independent actors within the complex model? Also, how would you describe the system of systems analysis that's being conducted here, assuming that each of the actors in your model is a representation of a system in itself?
Right. So, so for the feedback loops, hopefully I'm going to be answering this correctly. When you do a deterrence analysis, it's basically like that snapshot in time. And so then when you develop the objectives, you have to understand that things then change. So then therefore that system changed. So the feedback loop is you're essentially rerunning that whole decision calculus. You can maybe change a few things. So for time constraints, it wouldn't be as intensive. But with our NATO, we did a futuristic model, unclassified. So that way we can test the methodology. As far as what they're applying for, that's more of a classified level. And they provide feedback to me when they can, but it's essentially they've taken it and sort of ran with it. So I don't have additional feedback on real current time, how they're applying it. So the system of systems, so that's essentially what we're trying to do when it comes to the visualization, is understand that there's a whole system, an actor, within another system, the environment. So what you're doing, if I'm hopefully answering this correctly, what you're doing is you're first analyzing that first system. Then you're overlaying it with the second one, which is you're putting it together. And then how we've deconstructed it is we went through, well, then what way can we push on influence, or what way can we impact it if we're one of the systems, say NATO, or for one of the actors, say US, because you're going to have to take that approach. I mean, honestly, that's what you're trying to do, is you're building deterrence operations and objectives. So you're going to have to take a position somewhere. And the analysis is first attacking one system, then looking at the other, and delineate that of, well, how do we want to push on the influence points? I think that answered it.
I think you did as well. Thank you,
Okay,
Dr.
good.
Black.
I'll just take it.
So Curtis Jenkins from U.S. Northern Command asked if the U.S. is in a state of deterrence, and if so, by which actors?
That's a very broad question. So, I mean, so the way I would answer that is, an actor would be in a state of deterrence if their whole idea is not to be attacked or to be in a conflict with another one. So the question is, are we in a state? And then what was the second part?
If so, essentially what actors are we deterring?
Oh, geez. Like, which ones are we not? I mean, so ideally, when you're looking at the US, the way we would think about it before is, how do we deter actor A? And we would focus on that, and we would focus on actor A solely. How do we deter actor A from attacking us? How do we deter from being brought into a conflict with them? And then we would also look at actor B, and we would look specifically in that line of them and them only. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to simultaneously deter multiple actors within a geopolitical situation. So what situation are you looking at? And then what actors would be involved? Is the best I can really answer that question.
So he followed up with a little bit more of a specific question.
Okay, good.
And the question was about China specifically. So he asks, is current Chinese activity an indication that US deterrence efforts are working or not?
Okay, so that's a question that has to do with deterrence effectiveness. Are we being effective deterring China? And so, well, one, you'd have to understand, and this would go into the classified section. One, you'd have to understand if US is actively deterring China. And obviously I can't say anything on that, whether yes or no. Now, what their indication of whether they're not, their activities, absolutely. That's what you want to watch. You want to understand what they're doing to see if they're actually trying to go against some of our messages or some of our activities, or they're in alignment. I think there's a lot of great research out there that measures that. That doesn't really get enough attention right now. So I think, this specific approach does not measure the effectiveness But what it would do is say, how would China utilize other actors to as part of their deterrence objectives? And are we missing something? Are we not watching other actors that maybe China is in, so say, cahoots with, right? And we would be missing that part. So they could be in cahoots with somebody and they're doing something around about what our deterrence objectives and messages are. And we could be missing that as measuring the effectiveness of our deterrence operations. So that's what this approach does. It doesn't specifically measure the effectiveness. It just says open your eyes a bit more, because focusing on just China, you could be missing the boat.
Thank you, Dr. Block. Let's go with this question from Steve Renard next. And the question is if you can comment a little bit more about the effect of a presence of a non-rational actor.
So I get this question a lot about the non-rational actor. And so how I like to answer this has to do with when this approach doesn't really say whether they're rational or not, because they're within their framework and they're operating within their framework. So you want to know what it is in that side of the framework that you can push on, deter, influence. They don't necessarily have to be defined rationally in the sense as the US or others would define them. You want to understand their interests, their will, their intent on how they define it. Now, there may be some actors that you're not going to be able to push on in terms of influence because their will and intent is so specific to their objectives that you're not going to be able to just that influence no matter what you do. So you'll have to use or utilize some of the points that they do have. Maybe that's what we say lower in the scale of influence. So for example, if they have an objective, we'll just say a terrorist group has an objective to take over a certain country. Their intent and their willingness to do that is so absolute that no matter what message you send to them, will they be deterred to do it? You know, they'll do life, death, etc. But there are things that you can push on that they need to accomplish that, having to do with financial and capabilities, and whether they're in, again, cahoots with other actors that you can push on, which is a big part of triadic deterrence. And that's how triadic deterrence works. So again, looking at non-rational, take off the non-rational part and start looking at what in their framework are they defining their will, interests, risks, and intent. And that's where you're going to be able to find where you can push on messages.
Thank you, Dr. Black. Dr. Albert, Dr. Karen Albert replied essentially, or was commenting off your previous answer with a follow-up question. And that was, how do you evaluate the model with a non-rational actor since you can't use game or formal theory to use Bayesian modeling?
We haven't used any of the Bayesian modeling. And as far as the because that's sort of our next step. Our first step is looking at the information of J2 or the profiles and bringing them in and evaluating them, and then essentially going through a decision calculi and then mirroring them up with their interests and their conflicts and identifying where in this scenario that they actually work together or work against each other. And that's where you can find determined objectives, essentially in the DIME approach. As far as evaluating non-rational actors in Bayesian, we're not there yet, and we'd like to apply some of the methods and techniques to that to see how things could change, but we're not there yet. And I think that's a great question, Karen. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Dr. Black, for addressing it. Todd Veazey asked, the recently released 2022 National Security Strategy, Defense Strategy, places integrated deterrence as a centerpiece. Integrated deterrence is summarized as working seamlessly across warfighting domains theaters, the spectrum of conflict, other instruments of US national power, and our unmatched network of alliances and partnerships. Does this concept become unwieldy in the MADAM model, or does it map well into the model and enhance it?
So the way that the integrated deterrence and the strategy is that this is our in the 2022 strategy has to do with a response. So you are now implementing a response or a strategy to do against an adversary or adversaries. So what I would suggest when looking at the MADAM in even multi-actor approach is that what MADAM does is it produce objectives for you then to build your strategy. So that's the end part. The first part is you're trying to do the analysis, trying to understand the scope, what's going on in the geopolitical environment, building for those objectives, and then suggesting what strategy to use. And integrated deterrence would be part of that suggestion of, okay, this is where we would use integrated deterrence, or these capabilities would be part of this deterrence objective. So it would essentially, it's that J3 part towards the end that I had mentioned of you're going to need help with. So it's definitely part of it, but it's not the main analysis section.
All right, thank you, Dr. Black. So that's all of the questions that we currently have. Our audience members may come in the next few minutes to ask questions. But in the meantime, is there any sort of points that you'd like to drive home or concluding remarks that you would like to make to our audience?
Sure. So, like I had mentioned before, we've been working on this project for a little bit now, and it's exciting to see it actually get out there to the public. But we know there's a lot more to go. And where our team would really like to do is the experimentation part, because we're academics, and so we like to experiment and we like to perform research, which is something that I think is very difficult to do when you're in the government. You should know what you're doing and you should execute it, versus academics, we can really dig into a concept or a theory and experiment to see what the results are and then apply that. So what I'm trying to say is that as we've been developing this, it's exciting to now move towards this next iteration, and that's to test problems within this methodology to refine it. So we're happy to work with agencies to really test this out and see where it goes, and just happy to be here and be able to brief it to everybody.
Well, Dr. Black, thank you so much for briefing us today and for addressing our audience's questions. We got through a ton of questions in a short period of time, so I appreciate your succinct answers and appreciate everyone asking those questions.
Right.
We just got one last question. Sorry. This question was from Steve Renard, and the question was if your methodology has been applied to historical scenarios, i.e. Leading up to World War I.
So I just presented last week, and so an audience member had a suggestion of actually doing a historical case and to see what would come out of it, to see if the analysis then produced the end result. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. It's something that we might consider doing. So the answer to this question, no, we haven't done it, but we would like to do it.
Well, Dr. Black, thank you again. Thank you to your audience for tuning in today. We appreciate your support, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
All right, have a good one.